lot of content to get to. There is a lot to unpack. But I guess we'll start with the actual JFK files. We're going to dive in because there's a lot of ground to cover. We'll start with the JFK files themselves. And so during the election, Donald Trump, as you know, promised that he would declassify many of these classified files as they pertain to some of the most controversial events, in particular assassinations in American history. He said that he would declassify files for the JFK investigation, the assassination of MLK, and then there was a half-hearted commitment to declassifying the Epstein files. I didn't believe he would do it. I thought that was something that he said during the election, like other commitments that aren't being followed through on. I didn't believe it. And I still don't believe it, as it pertains at least to the Jeffrey Epstein files. But I was pleasantly surprised, like I said, that earlier this week, Trump did declassify and then release over 60,000 documents related to the investigation of the JFK assassination. It is worth pointing out, I would like to say, we did not get the Epstein files. We are getting these. Now, Trump will be in office for 3 more years, so there's time for him to release other files pertaining to MLK, maybe 9/11, maybe other things, and maybe the Jeffrey Epstein scandal. But it is worth pointing out, and I'll just say this at the very beginning, and I will note this, that I'm a little bit more interested in the Jeffrey Epstein files than the JFK files. This is great. I'm not complaining. I'm pleasantly surprised. But Jeffrey Epstein's a little bit more relevant, if for no reason other than that it is more recent. And it is related to people who are alive today. Which means that if we got to the bottom of Jeffrey Epstein's sex trafficking, blackmail, intelligence front operation, we might actually be able to indict and get answers from the people who were involved or are involved because they're still among us. The difference, of course, with the JFK files is that everybody involved is dead. Everybody who was involved in the killing of JFK was adult man or woman in the 1960s. And so that means that nearly everybody who is relevant, everybody who could provide more answers or see justice, they're gone. They're dead. And so it's good to know the information. It informs us, but it isn't actionable. And that's sort of the operative word. It's not actionable. I'd also add that because it happened so long ago, much of the information is archaic. And people today, unless they are a hobbyist or a researcher or an intellectual, really don't, in an accessible way, understand the context and the people involved in the JFK assassination. When we're talking about things like the Bay of Pigs, when we're talking about the foundation of the CIA, this is ancient history. We're talking about the National Crime Syndicate. This is stuff from the 40s, 50s, 60s. How much of this even has impact? To the extent that it informs us, for how many people will it even have impact? And so it's worth pointing out, I believe there is a premium placed on those Epstein files, if for no reason other than that they're recent, they're accessible, they're related to people that are alive today, they're actionable. And it's also worth pointing out, Epstein died in government custody when Trump was president the first time. And Trump knew Epstein. And so did Peter Thiel, and so did Elon Musk. Like, many of the relevant players that are alive and in power now were wrapped up, or you could say at the minimum, peripherally named in the Epstein case. And I almost wonder, is the JFK files, is the disclosure here, what's really the goal? Is it to distract from Epstein? Is it to delegitimize the CIA so that Peter Thiel's Palantir people can come in? If you destroy the credibility of the CIA, is this so that Palantir can come in and replace them? I almost wonder what even is the point. But I'm not going to knock it too much. I'm glad that we got the disclosure. But anyway, so Trump did release the files. This is a story. This is from the New York Times. It says, quote, the release of about 64,000 documents about the assassination of President Kennedy on Tuesday started a race to find a revelation as journalists, historians, and amateur sleuths scoured the pages in hopes of finding something, anything that could be considered consequential. Instead, the big reveal is that there wasn't much of a reveal at all. Here are the biggest takeaways of the blockbuster that wasn't. For years, as the government has declassified and published documents related, some very tenuously, to the Kennedy assassination, the assumption expressed by conspiracy theorists and some historians has been that anything still being withheld must be big. Even Kennedy's nephew, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., now the Secretary of HHS, had long called for the release of all the documents related to his uncle's death. But with the release of nearly 64,000 pages by the National Archives, including some that had been previously rendered opaque by redactions, it is becoming clear that something else might have been behind the decades of secrecy, protecting sources, and perhaps unsavory practices of U.S. intelligence operations. The files are filled with details about the agency's agents and informants, covert actions, and budget lines. The secrets, it seems, were the small details, not any big news. On Monday, President Trump said he would release 80,000 pages of documents related to the assassination within 24 hours. There would be no redactions, he said. In 2 document dumps on Tuesday evening, about 64,000 of those were made public. Some of them did indeed have information blocked off, but that is still 16,000 files short of what Mr. Trump promised. So like I said, we got a lot of stuff. We didn't get all of it, but it is the biggest document dump in recent history. And people are working through them just because of the sheer volume. I would imagine that not every rock has been unturned yet, so it's premature to say that there's nothing. But from what people have examined so far, it does not seem that there is a smoking gun inside the documents. 64,000 documents out. Everybody's been looking through them, and it doesn't seem that there's anything truly shocking. I covered this last night briefly. It seems that the biggest disclosure out of the files is a series of documents which were made public years ago. I believe they were released in 2017. But in this dump, they were unredacted. And these are some documents concerning a Senate hearing which took place behind closed doors with a Senate committee and a very high-ranking member of the CIA named James Angleton. And that seems to be so far the biggest bombshell. In his testimony, which is now, again, unredacted, so these notes, they did come out years ago, but they were heavily redacted. In the now unredacted documents from this closed-door hearing, which took place in 1975, it seems, although it isn't said explicitly, it isn't said directly, it is heavily implied that James Angleton, who was the head of counterintelligence in the CIA from basically the time the CIA was created in 1947 until the 1970s in the administration of Gerald Ford, he says in this closed-door hearing, or he implies strongly, that he was facilitating the transfer of nuclear secrets from the United States government to Israel for the purpose of Israel building its nuclear program, which would result in Israel acquiring a nuclear bomb, which is a monumental development in the history of the region and the history of the world. So that seems to be the biggest development. That seems to be the biggest bombshell out of the documents. Again, there's no smoking gun. He doesn't say it explicitly. If you actually read the transcript, he's pressed about it. He's evasive. They say, was Israel looking to acquire a nuclear weapon? He says, well, everyone was looking to acquire a weapon, and that doesn't exclude Israel. They say, well, did they succeed? Did they get information from us? And Angleton says, well, let's talk about this off the record. And so it is heavily implied by these and other things that were said in the hearing that Angleton was not only aware of Israel's nuclear program, which was a weapons program, but was also actively facilitating it. And if you know anything about the JFK assassination, which we will get into during this show, that is the unspoken third rail of the JFK conspiracy literature. If you know anything about the killing of JFK, if you know anything about the various conspiracy theories about who might be responsible, it concerns a few different blocks in American society: organized crime, the CIA, and the Pentagon. And the unspoken element that nobody ever talks about is the Israel lobby, the state of Israel, the Israel lobby. And researchers and analysts and theorists have explored the various motivations, who would want Kennedy dead. And because the conspiracy literature is dominated by liberals and probably also dominated by CIA agents themselves, who are trying to redirect blame or come up with these red herring false narratives, they'll variously say that JFK was killed by Cold Warriors. JFK did not want to depose Fidel Castro in Cuba or go to war in Cuba. JFK, they thought, was taking it easy on the Soviet Union, made a deal in the Cuban Missile Crisis to pull American Jupiter missiles out of Turkey and look for a rapprochement with the Soviet Union. And so one theory is it was the Pentagon, it was the CIA, it was fanatical right-wing anti-communists. They wanted their war in Cuba. They wanted their war in Vietnam. They wanted to go hard on the Soviet Union, so they got rid of Kennedy, which is plausible. Another theory is that organized crime killed Kennedy as revenge. They helped Kennedy get the nomination. They helped him get elected. And JFK appointed his brother, who was virulently against organized crime. And as Attorney General RFK, Robert Kennedy, declared a war on the mob. So they killed him because he reneged on an agreement that was made between Jack Kennedy and the mob, or some say between Jack Kennedy's father and the mob. But the third rail in the literature, again, so people talk about the CIA, people talk about the mob, people talk about anti-Castro Cubans. People never talk about the role of the Israel lobby and their motivation, which is that at the same time that JFK was feuding with the mob, at the same time that he was feuding with the CIA and the Cold Warriors, what is not explored and what has not been talked about is JFK's secret private war behind closed doors inside the White House with Israel and Israel's lobby, specifically as it pertains to Israel's nuclear program and the development of Israel's nuclear bomb, their nuclear weapons capability. So, the reason that this is such a bombshell in the JFK files is because this concerns one of the key players in the JFK conspiracy, James Angleton, who was a very powerful member in the CIA, which we'll talk about him, and in particular, how he became such a powerful figure and what he was doing inside the CIA. But it also concerned that other element, that unspoken element, which is the Israel lobby, the Israeli state, and its reason for killing JFK, or its motivation, why they might want to kill JFK, which is their ambitions to acquire a nuclear arsenal. So to put it simply, if the conspiracy theory says that the CIA had a role in killing Kennedy, and if the literature says that the CIA wanted to kill Kennedy, and Angleton was a high-ranking member of the CIA, and if Israel wanted Kennedy dead because of their nuclear program, which Kennedy tried to thwart, and if Angleton was assisting, aiding, and abetting Israel in their quest for a nuclear bomb against Kennedy, and this is what is revealed, that might give credence to the idea that there was some overlap between organized crime, the CIA, the Israel lobby in killing Kennedy, and that Israel's acquisition of a nuclear weapon might be one of the primary or definitive motivations for why this network came together, why this conspiracy came together to kill JFK. So that's the relevance of the story, or rather of the documents which were released on Tuesday. But again, so far, 64,000 out of 80,000 documents. We don't even have all of it. And I imagine that people have not thoroughly gone over everything. I don't even know how that would be possible, except now with the use of artificial intelligence. So we'll have to wait and see. Maybe there will be more connections and more information that is released or more that is found. But for now, that is the big bombshell. But I want to move on. I do want to get into the JFK conspiracy itself. And we're going to go over that big idea, what I just touched on, which is the Israeli nuclear program. And we're going to go over a lot of big things. So bear with me because I'm going to try to keep this as organized and structured as possible. And I'm going to try to include really the most important information. And so I guess we could start with what people understand about the JFK conspiracy. We'll talk about the killing itself. So JFK was elected in 1960. He's a Democrat. And the context of all of this is that he is elected in the middle of the Cold War. He's elected 3 years after the Sputnik satellite is launched by the Soviet Union. He's elected as the arms race is happening alongside the space race. U.S. and Soviet Union are racing to develop more sophisticated nuclear weapons and missiles. This is happening at the same time that the Cold War is really beginning. And there is a theory promulgated by the military establishment, the domino theory, that all around the world in Asia, Latin America, and Europe, countries are falling to communism and falling under the sphere of influence of the Soviet Union. And they believe that as one country falls, other countries adjacent to them will fall. And so we're now completely locked in against the Soviet Union in this battle for basically world domination, trying to roll back and stop the spread of communism and uphold the influence of the United States in the post-World War II era. This is also happening in the context of the Cuban Revolution, Algerian independence from France. It's also happening in the context of Israel's conflict with the Arab nations. And we'll see the importance of that in a moment. So this is the context in which JFK is elected president. And like I said, over the years, as a reformer, he makes a lot of enemies. And we'll talk about the 3 key blocks that he alienates, but I suppose we could talk first about the actual killing. So JFK, the timeline, he's inaugurated in 1961. He's killed in 1963, November 22nd. He's killed in Dallas, Texas. And of course, everybody knows the mainstream story, the official story, is that he is shot when he takes a slow turn down Elm Street. And it's what they call a dog curve. It's like an S-shaped curve street. He's riding in a motorcade inside of a convertible with an open top. And when his motorcade slows down to take the turn on Elm Street, he is situated in a perfect kill zone. And they say there's a triangulation between a few key spots located around this street where he can be shot from many different angles. The official story is that he's shot from up high in the book depository building by Lee Harvey Oswald. 3 shots go out, but it's one bullet that hits JFK, hits the governor who's sitting in front of him, kills JFK instantly. He's shot in the throat. Lee Harvey Oswald runs away, shoots a cop. He gets arrested in a movie theater. He gets picked up. Already they know who he is. 2 days later, Lee Harvey Oswald is being transferred from police custody to the local jail. Lee Harvey Oswald, apparently the one who shot JFK and killed him and apparently acted alone, he in turn is assassinated by a low-level Jewish mobster named Jack Ruby. Jack Ruby ambushes him, shoots him in the stomach. Lee Harvey Oswald dies. Everything he knows dies with him. And apparently Jack Ruby, who's now a secondary assassin, he also acted alone. Lyndon Johnson becomes the president of the United States. A commission is convened led by the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Earl Warren. It's called the Warren Commission. They investigate. And the official investigation of the U.S. government says that it was a lone gunman who killed JFK. Lee Harvey Oswald, they say, is a lone nut, meaning that he acted by himself. There was no outside help. There were no accomplices. And that means not only were there no people helping him, but there were no other gunmen either. Just him. He was the only one shooting. He was the only one that acted. And that's it. They also say that he was not acting on behalf of any foreign government, wasn't acting on behalf of the Soviet Union or the KGB. They say he wasn't acting on behalf of anti-Castro mercenaries or forces who were inside the United States, wasn't acting on behalf of the mob or some other criminal element. They say it was just Lee Harvey Oswald, and that's it. That's the official story. The problem with the official story right out of the gate is Lee Harvey Oswald himself, who they say is apparently the lone nut. And the reason that there is so much speculation about the JFK killing from the very beginning, I mean, you go back to 1966, and there are very big publications, there's stories in the press, which are doubting the official narrative. Almost right away, years after the fact, people do not believe the official story from the Warren Commission. They do not believe the official narrative. Even the CIA itself does not believe the official narrative. Weeks after JFK was killed, the CIA puts a message out to all of its stations in the United States and asks them to interrogate their Cuban agents, because the CIA does not believe that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. They wonder if one of their people did it. And if we start there, the reason the CIA itself didn't believe that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone is because Lee Harvey Oswald was effectively under the influence of the CIA. And it is a known fact that Lee Harvey Oswald was under basically constant CIA surveillance from 1959 in November until he killed Kennedy, allegedly, in November 1963. He was under CIA surveillance for 4 years. All of his letters, all of his mail was being read by the CIA. And during this time, when he was living in the United States, he moved to the Soviet Union in 1959. He came back to the United States a few years later. The entire time that he lived in the United States in Texas, he was constantly being handled and managed and surveilled by CIA assets. No fewer than 6 official codenamed CIA personnel were in constant communication with and handling Lee Harvey Oswald. It was revealed in recent documents, not the ones from this week, but in the past, that the day before JFK was killed, there was a 180-page dossier all about Lee Harvey Oswald on James Angleton's desk. James Angleton, who was the head of counterintelligence in the CIA, who was named in the recent document dump. And so this reminds me of a lot of the mass shootings that happened today. When you look at really any of these mass casualty events, mass shootings, high-level assassinations, it's always peculiar how the CIA is never very far behind. And it's just as true today when you look at like the Buffalo shooter in New York, when you look at the, apparently the people who are trying to kill Trump on behalf of Iran recently, it's just as true today as it was back then in the 60s. Lee Harvey Oswald, your lone gunman, this is a CIA asset. Known to the CIA, again, 180-page dossier was on James Angleton's desk, all about this person, the day before Kennedy was killed. So there's your problem. And we'll get into some of the peculiarities about who specifically in the CIA was handling Oswald. That person was James Angleton. So when we talk about the CIA, it's not enough to say broadly the CIA, because during the JFK administration, the CIA underwent leadership changes. After the Bay of Pigs, JFK sacked the leadership and tried to reform the whole outfit. He appointed his own leader, the CIA, who was loyal to him. It was James Angleton who was handling Oswald, handling the people that handled Oswald. It was Angleton's people who were reading Oswald's mail, and that is what was revealed in the Biden document dump a couple of years ago. And we'll get into exactly who was reading that mail and how that pertains to Angleton as we work through some of the history that goes back a couple of decades before the killing of Kennedy. But suffice to say, when we look at the official story, it immediately falls apart, and there's a very good reason for skepticism when you consider that Oswald was a very peculiar figure who was known to the intelligence community. But then, maybe even the bigger smoking gun, no pun intended, is not just Lee Harvey Oswald, who is known to the CIA. He's allegedly the lone gunman. But the real smoking gun is Jack Ruby, the man that killed Oswald. And this is another aspect of, again, we don't have time really to get into this dimension of the story, but it's interesting that in all of the literature about the JFK assassination, the most well-known conspiracy literature, allegedly the most credible, the most mainstream, and supposedly the most thorough JFK assassination research does not mention that Jack Ruby is not even his real name. Jack Ruby, who killed the assassin, silencing him forever. The Warren Commission, the U.S. government, the American media, they pin the assassination on a lone gunman who is handled by the CIA for years. You would wonder what story he would tell. He himself claimed he was a patsy. He was silenced forever by Jack Ruby. Isn't that worthwhile to understand who he is? In all the literature, almost nobody mentions that Jack Ruby was Jewish. And his real name is Jack Rubenstein, Jacob Rubenstein, who was born in Chicago and moved to Dallas with a dozen mobsters, most of them Jewish, where he was involved in various ventures with the Jewish mafia, including Mickey Cohen, including Meyer Lansky, including a number of other people in the New Orleans, Dallas underworld. And allegedly, he confessed to his rabbi when he was jailed for the killing of Oswald. When asked why he did it, what was his motivation, he said he did it for the Jewish people. That's alleged. But so that's for openers. This is the JFK assassination itself. That's your reason for skepticism. The killer of Kennedy, the one whom the entire plot is pinned upon, he acted alone, he's a lone nut. It's very suspicious that he was handled by the CIA, surveilled by the CIA, known to the CIA for many years. It is equally suspicious that he was silenced. And when we investigate the person who silenced him, we find that he was not a lone nut either. And even in the conspiracy literature, there appears to be a cover-up within a cover-up about the identity of this person. But I want to go back to the very beginning and give some historical context of the conspiracy, where it all really comes from, because you have to go all the way back to understand how these various elements came to be involved. So they say that if Oswald did not act alone, they say that if Jack Ruby was involved with some other element, the question is, well, then who did kill JFK? That's obviously the big question. If we don't accept the narrative that it's just Oswald, and if there are legitimate questions about what the relationship was between intelligence and Oswald and what the relationship was between organized crime and Ruby, then the question is, who really killed JFK? And if there was an accomplice, if there was some sort of backing, if there was sponsorship or a broader conspiracy, then who was involved? Which were the organizations? Who were the people? What were the names? How did they carry it out? Where did it come from? And again, the big three that people focus on, I suppose you could say the big two, and the third one that is less talked about is the CIA, which knew Oswald, the Mafia, which knew Ruby, and they are both connected to each other, as we'll explore later, and the Israel lobby, which is involved with both intelligence and the Mafia. Those are generally considered to be the big three. Those are the ones that are blamed in the conspiracy literature for JFK being killed. But again, we have to go all the way back to the beginning. And in a way, the various organizations that worked together to kill Kennedy, it's a story of all of these various founders. This is a story that's concerning organized crime and the people that founded organized crime in America. It's a story concerning the intelligence agencies in the United States and who founded those, the founders of the CIA in particular, and the Jewish lobby or the State of Israel and the founding father of the State of Israel. The founding fathers of all three are involved in the story, and we have to explore where they came from, how they overlap, the leaders of them, and their various interests. And something that's important to understand, for example, they talk about the role of organized crime in killing Kennedy. The popular conception is, as we talked about earlier, JFK made a deal with the mob because the Democratic cities which controlled the political process were mobbed up with organized crime. They say that Jack Kennedy and his father, Joseph Kennedy, made a deal with the Chicago outfit and other mobsters that they would pour money into the Democratic primary and put their finger on the scale in the general election to carry the election for Kennedy. They say that when Kennedy appointed RFK as Attorney General, who declared war on organized crime, they say that Jack Kennedy broke his deal, wasn't holding up his end of the bargain, and that is why the Mafia participated. But it's interesting about the Mafia. When we think about organized crime in the United States, we think about Italians. And when you say the Mafia killed JFK, well, Mafia itself, or Cosa Nostra, these are Italian words. And we talk about some of the leaders of the Italian mob in the Chicago outfit or the families in New York. What people don't talk about is that there's a very big other ethnic influence in organized crime, and that is the Jewish mob. And if you go back to the very beginning, to the era of Prohibition, what emerges at the end of the 20s is a national crime syndicate, which is an alliance between the Italian mob, which is run out of New York, but also other major cities. But it's represented by Charles Lucky Luciano and a guy named Meyer Lansky, who is laundering the money. And he also represents the Jewish mafia, the Jewish mob on the other side. And so although everybody thinks when they consider something like the JFK assassination that the mob, they think about Frank Costello, they think about Frank Sinatra, they think about Sam Giancana. Because we think about Italians when we think about the mafia. But nobody thinks about the other side of the national organized crime organization, the syndicate, which is the Jewish mob. And so throughout the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, there is an Italian organized crime in the country, but they're deeply embedded with the Jewish mob. And so let's start there. That organized crime in the United States, to the extent that it was involved in the JFK assassination and many other activities, has an Italian side, but it also has a Jewish side. There's also something to consider about the JFK assassination, and in particular, the role of intelligence. So they say there's the mafia angle, but there's also the intelligence angle. And they say that it is people like James Angleton who conspired to kill Kennedy. People talk about how Jack Kennedy, there's a very famous quote that's attributed to him. After the failed Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba in 1961, which was a national embarrassment, national humiliation, JFK was purported to have said, I'm going to shatter the CIA into 1,000,000 pieces and throw it into the wind, or something to that effect. And JFK did sack the leadership of the CIA. Not only that, he went against many of their recommendations. In particular, an operation called Operation Northwoods. They wanted to do a false flag attack in America and blame it on Cuba so that the United States would have a pretext to go to war in Cuba and overthrow their communist government. It was for decisions like this, among others, that the CIA and other elements in the military thought that JFK was soft on communism. JFK was at odds with the CIA. He resisted the CIA. They disobeyed him. And so he sought to reorganize the CIA to make it subservient to the civilian government. So they say that it was for reasons related to the Cold War and its prosecution in Vietnam or Cuba and other places, which is why the CIA killed Kennedy. But let's talk about what the CIA is. When people think about the CIA, they think that law enforcement and the intelligence agencies are on the other side of organized crime. In people's minds, the CIA is filled with right-wing WASPs, right-wing anti-communist Republicans, and they think of the CIA as divorced from organized crime and maybe divorced from other influences. But that's not the case. Because when Meyer Lansky, running the Jewish mob, and when Charles Luciano came together and formed the crime syndicate in the 30s, they worked hand in glove with American military intelligence. During World War II, you didn't have a CIA. You had OSS. That was the precursor to the CIA. During World War II, the military was concerned about potential sabotage on America's ports on its East Coast. There was a major act of military espionage and sabotage when a major military arms depot exploded in New Jersey. And so military intelligence at that time actually worked with organized crime. They struck up a partnership. And the deal was this. Military intelligence and the government effectively gave clemency to people like Luciano and other members of organized crime in exchange for protection and intelligence. Organized crime ran the docks. They ran the ports. Organized crime had their own ground, street-level intelligence network. And so military intelligence relied on the mob and the relationship with labor, their relationship with the ports and the docks, with trade, and also in some ways on their intelligence for the war effort. In exchange, they took it easy and turned the other way on some of the mafia's activities. But there was also something particular going on with regard to the mob. The mob was Jewish and Italian. During World War II, the United States was at war with fascist Italy. When the United States was preparing to invade Italy, they consulted with the Italian mob for intelligence on how they might invade Sicily and then how they might invade the mainland. And that's because the Italian mafia was transnational. You had Italian mobsters in the United States that were living in New York, but they also maintained close relationships with organized crime in Italy, in the homeland. And so there was a transnational network of Italian mobsters there and Italian mobsters here, which was another big source of help for military intelligence during World War II as the Allies were launching an invasion of Sicily and then Italy. This is where James Angleton comes in. When the United States takes over Italy, James Angleton is running military intelligence in Italy. The reason this is significant is because there is this relationship going on throughout the war between Italian mafia, which is connected to the Jewish mafia, and the Allied war effort. So James Angleton, before the CIA is even created, he is running military intelligence. He is running the OSS in the entire country of Italy. When the war ends in Italy, there's something very peculiar that's going on. We got to get into the specifics here. During World War II, Jewish people are fleeing Europe. They're fleeing Europe because of the Holocaust. And when they're fleeing Europe, they're going to they're coming to the United States, they're going to other countries, but many of them are being transferred over into Palestine. The year's 1945, Israel has not yet been created, but the Zionist project at this point is well underway. Jewish people are settling what is then called Mandatory Palestine, which is under the control of Great Britain, the United Kingdom. And so the primordial government, which is called the Jewish Agency at that time, which is facilitating and administering the Jewish community in Palestine, it is working to bring Jewish refugees into Palestine from Europe. And one of the major launch pads for Jewish refugees from Europe into Palestine is Italy. So during World War II, you have the mafia working with intelligence in New York City. The mafia is Italian and Jewish. Because the mafia is Italian, they're providing military intelligence with information so that they can successfully invade Sicily and Italy, because the Italian mafia is transnational. It's in Italy and New York. When the Allies take over Italy, you have an intelligence operation there which is run by James Angleton. Italy, after and actually even during the war, before Germany's defeated, is a springboard for Jews leaving Europe and going to Palestine. Well, it is during this time that James Angleton is tasked with liaising with various other countries' intelligence agencies. He's tasked with effectively creating what would become the CIA. He's tasked with creating an international intelligence network. And Angleton sees the Jews who are fleeing Europe and going to Palestine as a source of intelligence. So the Jews are leaving Italy, they're going to Palestine, and Angleton is identifying them and recruiting them effectively as CIA assets before the CIA is created. He believes that because they're coming out of Germany, they know something about Germany. They're coming out of various European nations, they might know something about Europe. And so Angleton's use of Jewish emigres from Europe to Palestine, which is what would become Israel, they form the basis of his intelligence network. This is very important. At the same time that people are being smuggled out of Italy, guns are being smuggled out of Italy as well. Not only is the Jewish Agency, not only are the Zionists in Palestine, they're bringing Jews out of Europe to Palestine from Italy, but they're also smuggling World War II weapons from Europe to arm the early Zionist militant groups in Palestine. This is all happening while James Angleton is running Italy. James Angleton working with the Italian mob in Italy. James Angleton running the OSS in Italy, working with the Jewish emigres going to Palestine. Under his nose, while he's turning a blind eye, not to mix metaphors, the Zionists are not just moving the people out of Italy, but they're also moving weapons out of Italy into Palestine. And there's this triangle that's being created. In 1947, Angleton comes back to the United States and becomes a founding officer of the CIA. He's there at the very beginning. A year later, 1948, Israel is established. When Israel declares its independence in 1948, immediately all of its Arab neighbors declare war on it. So World War II happens, the Holocaust happens, so they say. This is actually a boon to the Zionist project. Throughout World War II, Jews are pouring out of Europe and into Palestine, and they are going to form the demographic base for the state of Israel. So in the years between the end of World War II and 1948, the Zionists, the Jews in Palestine are getting ready, and in 1948, they declare independence. They declared the state of Israel officially. Immediately, all the Muslim countries go to war against Israel. Egypt, Syria, Transjordan, Iraq, Yemen, Saudi Arabia. Every Arab country declares war on Israel when it declares its independence. and you have the first Arab-Israeli war, where a coalition of every Arab country goes against Israel. And this is a sink or swim moment. If Israel loses the war, the Zionist project, which is 50 years old, 60 years old at that time, is over. And probably they're extinct. They just get out of the Holocaust in their mind. They go to Israel. If they get defeated by the Arabs, it's over. And the dream of Jewish independence or a Jewish homeland is over. They have to win the war. Eventually, a ceasefire is declared. The United States has an arms embargo on Israel and Egypt. So neither the Arab side nor the Jewish side is getting weapons. This is where the Jews rely on their connections in organized crime in the United States to smuggle weapons from the United States to Israel, to help them in their war, primarily against Egypt and Syria, but also against all the other Arab countries. The U.S. has an arms embargo, will not support either side. So Israel relies upon its transnational crime network. They rely upon the Jewish mafia, which has connections with the Italian mafia, which helps them to smuggle weapons from the United States, surplus weapons from the war to Israel to help them overcome the Arabs. And this is the story. I'll read this. This is from a Jewish publication. This is from a Jewish publication, which is called Tablet, actually, so nobody can accuse me of being a conspiracy theorist or something like that. Let me pull this up in my notes. Give me just one moment. So this is from Tablet Magazine. We've actually covered Tablet on the show many times before in other conversations about Israel, so it's somewhat relevant. This is from Tablet Magazine. It describes some of the arms trafficking efforts. It says, quote, in 1945, the Jewish agency, the pre-state Israeli government, headed by David Ben-Gurion, created a vast clandestine arms purchasing and smuggling network throughout the United States. The operation was placed under the aegis of the Haganah, which is the forerunner to the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force. And it involved hundreds of Americans from every walk of life, including Jewish organized crime. In particular, one mobster named Mickey Cohen. In his autobiography, West Coast mobster Mickey Cohen claimed that after meeting Haganah and Irgun emissaries, those are Jewish militant groups in Palestine, he became so absorbed with Israel that he pushed aside much of his own activities and did nothing but try to help Israel in its war. He said, I got involved with this GD Israel war for 3 years. In his memoirs, he claims that he held fundraising affairs to raise money for Israel to procure weapons. In 1947, he organized a fundraiser for the Irgun. Leading Jewish underworld figures from California and Las Vegas attended, and according to Cohen and other attendees, thousands of dollars were collected. The money, Cohen claimed, was used to buy weapons and have them shipped to Israel. Mickey Cohen was the successor to Bugsy Siegel. Bugsy Siegel was Meyer Lansky's right-hand man. So the National Crime Syndicate, the multi-ethnic national organized crime group, was founded by Jewish mobster Meyer Lansky and Italian mobster Lucky Luciano. They worked with the CIA. They helped the CIA and the Allies take over Italy, which was then under the control of Angleton. Angleton facilitated the Jews leaving Italy, going to Palestine to form Israel. He used them as a source, and in the meantime turned a blind eye to Meyer Lansky's criminal activities, as well as the gun running from Italy to Palestine. And Meyer Lansky, as well as his subordinates like Mickey Cohen, they were smuggling weapons from the United States to Israel for its War of Independence in 1948. This is how they're all connected. So you notice how there's all this talk about the mafia organized crime. There's all this talk about the CIA. They act like the mafia is Italian and the CIA is right-wing, and it's right-wing WASPs. or that they're separate. In reality, the mafia and the CIA are two sides of the same coin. And what transcends both is a Jewish influence. The CIA is influenced by Jews because the transnational Jews are the source of the CIA's vast intelligence network. Jews leaving Italy and going to Palestine are tapped by Angleton. And in organized crime, it is the Jewish mafia, which is helping the Italian mafia launder its money in Switzerland. And the Jewish mafia is running casinos and doing other activities for them as well. And so you have the mafia, intel agencies working together, but the dimension that is never talked about is how a vast Jewish network connects them both. So this is going on throughout the 1940s. Let's talk about Israel in particular. So after the 1948 war, Israel is victorious. Israel defeats the combined Arab armies. They are humiliated, they are defeated, and for the time being, Israel is safe. That is, until the mid-1950s, there is the emergence of an Egyptian dictator named Nasser. Nasser has a pan-Arabist ideology. He wants to unite all Arab countries on the basis of them being Arab. Not necessarily a theocratic Muslim religious leader. He is a nationalist leader, and he wants to unite the Middle East on the basis of their Arab ethnicity. He's a pan-Arabist. So when Egypt gains its independence, shortly afterward, Nasser becomes the president. Nasser takes over the Suez Canal. He nationalizes it. It is owned by Britain and France. Nasser takes over the Suez Canal so that Egypt can make money from it. And this is his nationalist, third worldist, anti-colonial ideology. He believes that the revenues from the Suez Canal should serve Egypt. Israel, the United Kingdom, and France cook up a plan where Israel is going to invade Egypt. And once Israel goes to war with Egypt, once they invade the Sinai Peninsula, this will create a pretext for France and Britain to intervene. They will say they're coming in as peacekeepers. In reality, what they're doing is taking back control over the canal. And that's exactly what happens in 1956. Israel invades the Sinai, and they have their own reasons. There's multiple reasons for doing this. They invade because they're threatened by Nasser. They're threatened by Egypt. They fear that Nasser wants to attack them. And Nasser has also blockaded one of their ports. So Israel invades the Sinai in collaboration with Britain and France. Britain and France come in as peacekeepers, and they take control of the canal. This is under the administration of Eisenhower. This is in 1956. At this time, the United States does not have an absolutely pro-Israel foreign policy. The United States, under Truman, from 48 to 52, from the creation of the State of Israel until he leaves office in 52, and then throughout the reign of Eisenhower, the United States is trying to cut down the middle between Israel and the Arabs. They want to maintain good relations with both. And in this time, the United States is not giving military aid to Israel. At least it's very minimal. And for a short time, there's an arms embargo on both. And so when Israel invades Sinai, when they attack Egypt in 1956, in collaboration with Britain and France, Eisenhower intervenes and gets them all to withdraw. Eisenhower says, "You're crazy. You're going to bring the Soviet Union into the Middle East?" If Egypt thinks that Israel and the West are teaming up on them, then Nasser is going to side with the Soviet Union, and that's going to bring the Soviet sphere of influence into the Middle East to a much greater extent. So he forces them all to withdraw. What is never discussed about this war is that there was another aspect to the deal. In 1956, Israel approaches the French, and Israel is not only smuggling guns from the United States and from Europe into Israel, the big weapon that they want is a nuclear bomb. After Israel declares its independence, and after they see the nuclear bomb in Japan, they see the Soviet Union test a nuclear device in 1949, the Israelis become obsessed with acquiring a nuclear weapon. David Ben Gurion is the founding father of Israel. He's the first prime minister. He's considered the soul. He's like their George Washington. David Ben Gurion is obsessed with acquiring a nuclear bomb. In 1956, the Israelis go to France and say, "We will attack Egypt if you give us a nuclear reactor." And the French agree. In 1958, the French go to Israel after the war is over and Israel holds up its end of the bargain, and France begins to build a nuclear reactor inside Israel's desert in the Negev in the south. This is the beginning of Israel's nuclear program. And this is based on Israel's, honestly, credible fear about their Arab neighbors. Their entire region declares war on them in 1948. Their neighbor, Egypt, which at that time is a regional power, is looking to organize the entire region on the basis of Arab ethnicity to go to war against Israel. They form a united republic with Syria in the 50s. Israel understands that the ultimate deterrent, the ultimate weapon, which will give them an advantage over every country put together in the region, is the nuclear bomb. And they say that since Jews invented the nuclear bomb, if Einstein, Oppenheimer, and Teller invented the nuclear device for the United States, they say the Jews in Israel can invent the nuclear bomb. And so the Jews do some work on uranium extraction and some other things. They do some technology sharing with France. And ultimately, they come to this deal where they will invade Egypt so that France and the United Kingdom can take back the Suez. And in exchange, part of the deal is that France is going to build for them a nuclear reactor. They're going to supply them with uranium, which will allow Israel to refine plutonium and build a weapon. They need plutonium for a nuclear bomb, which will give them an edge. This is what is important about this relationship. And this sets the stage for John F. Kennedy's presidency. Let's talk about John F. Kennedy himself for a moment, because there's some interesting things in his past that actually already sour the relationship with Israel and the Jews, among others. What a lot of people don't know about Jack Kennedy is that him, his brother, who died in World War II, and his father were all Nazi sympathizers. Joseph Kennedy, his father, is very rich and was deeply involved in the underworld during Prohibition. He was involved in bootlegging. He had a long-standing feud with Meyer Lansky himself and relations with the mob. Run-ins with the mob, was almost killed by the Detroit Jewish mafia at one point. Joseph Kennedy was an admirer of Adolf Hitler. Joseph Kennedy, during World War II, was an ambassador to Great Britain. And before the United States entered the war, Joseph Kennedy was outspoken opposing U.S. entry into the war. When war was declared, he returned to the United States and went on a campaign against President Roosevelt, which was a big deal because this is a high-level ambassador. He's a well-respected Democrat, very established. Joseph Kennedy is going to embark on a campaign against American involvement in World War II. Joseph Kennedy has a lot of views that are similar to like what Daryl Cooper says on Joe Rogan. You know, now it's become somewhat in vogue. It's in vogue lately. People say that Churchill is the true villain of World War II. He brought us into the war. This is what Joseph Kennedy was saying in the 40s. This is JFK's father. Said that Winston Churchill dragged the United States into the war. He said the United Kingdom is finished. We ought to stay out of it. And he sympathized with Hitler. At Harvard, JFK's brother, Joe Kennedy, was part of a student-based organization opposing U.S. intervention in the war. JFK himself wrote in his diary that he wished his father took it further in his opposition to the war. JFK said we should have never went involved. He actually wrote speeches for his father. And JFK was so against World War II, he himself was surveilled by the FBI. Jack Kennedy, JFK, the future president, was surveilled by the FBI for his anti-war views, and in particular because he supported his father's anti-war views. And everybody at this point knows JFK himself wrote positive things about Hitler. He visited fascist Italy, Nazi Germany. He visited Europe before the war, and he said, I think that communism is for the Russians, fascism is for the Italians and Germans, and democracy's for us and the British. And years later, he wrote about how he had a great admiration for Hitler. So already the Jews did not like the Kennedys because of Joseph Kennedy, because of who JFK's father was. The Jews knew who Joseph Kennedy was, and they didn't like him because they considered that the Kennedys were Catholics. And at that time, Catholics were associated with anti-communists, McCarthyists, anti-Semitism. And they thought that they were those Kennedys who opposed World War II, who didn't save the Jews in the Holocaust. Never mind that JFK was injured in the war. His brother died in the war. But they already didn't like him. As a senator, JFK, before he was president, he was a senator from Massachusetts. His first speech as a member of the House Foreign Committee in 1957, he spoke in favor of Algerian independence from France. This is something else the Israelis deeply opposed. In the 1950s, France was in their own Vietnam. I mean, they had their own Vietnam War, but Algeria was like their equivalent of the Vietnam War. France fought a brutal war in their colony, Algeria, to maintain control over it. And there was this question whether France should keep control over it or whether they'd turn it over to an Islamic government. And JFK weighed in as a senator and gave a big, prominent speech in favor of independence, effectively. The Jews didn't like him for that either. So already the stage is set that there's this conflict. So in the 1960s, JFK is elected. He's elected in 1960. And even though there's this tension between his family and the Jewish community, JFK actually gets some support from the Jews. There's a very prominent manufacturing mogul named Abe Feinberg who meets with JFK in his New York apartment in 1960. And Feinberg says very bluntly to Jack Kennedy, he goes, look, we know your campaign needs money. We're going to give you $500,000. In exchange, we want to write your Israel policy. And JFK took the money from the Israel lobby. Even back then, this stuff was going on. You know, we talk about AIPAC and Miriam Adelson now. This has been going on forever. So JFK meets with Abe Feinberg, who's a big member of the Jewish lobby himself, the Israel lobby. They give him $500,000. They say, we want to write your Middle East policy. Those are our conditions. JFK's furious. The next day, he tells his best friend, I can't believe that they would say to an American running for president that we want to write your policy. I can't believe it works this way. In addition, JFK gets help from the Jewish-aligned mafia. They say that Joseph Kennedy and Jack Kennedy have a meeting with Sam Giancana from the Chicago outfit. And they say that JFK will be your man in the White House. In exchange, the mafia pours money into JFK's campaign in the primary in states like West Virginia, and they put their finger on the scale in the general election in Illinois. They help him carry the state. This is how JFK gets into office. Now, the first thing that happens when JFK gets in, before he even gets in, is that the CIA makes the Eisenhower administration aware of Israel's nuclear program. They tell Eisenhower that Israel, in collaboration with the French, is building a nuclear reactor in the desert, although they're not sure if it's for weapons purposes just yet. This is in the fall of 1960, around the time of the election. January 19th, the day before JFK is inaugurated, he asks the outgoing Secretary of State, who is pursuing a nuclear arsenal? They say India and Israel. And JFK is immediately stressed out about the news. He learns that JFK wants a bomb. Almost immediately after he gets inaugurated, JFK sends a letter to the leader of Israel, Prime Minister Ben-Gurion, and says, we want to inspect your nuclear reactor. We know you've got a nuclear program. we want to inspect it and we want to make sure that you're not using it for weapons purposes. And this inaugurates a 2-year correspondence between Jack Kennedy and Ben-Gurion about the nuclear program, which becomes increasingly contentious. And I'll read to you, this is a survey of the correspondence between JFK and the Prime Minister of Israel. And this is from an Israeli paper called Haaretz. So again, it's another Jewish source. It says, quote, in the fall of 1960, the outgoing Eisenhower administration first became aware of Israel's Dimona reactor that Israel and France had begun building in secret in 1958. The CIA issued a special national intelligence estimate that determined that plutonium production for weapons is at least one major purpose of the effort. Furthermore, the estimate predicted that if the Arab world believed that Israel was acquiring a nuclear weapons capability, they would blame the United States and France, presumably for supporting the project. At a White House briefing on January 19th, Kennedy inquired the outgoing Secretary of State, Christian Herter, which countries were seeking the bomb. He said Israel and India. He added that the newly discovered Dimona reactor would be able to produce enough weapons-grade plutonium for 10 to 15 nuclear weapons. He urged Kennedy to press hard for inspections for Dimona before Israel introduced such weapons into the Middle East. Within days of taking office, Kennedy began urging Ben-Gurion to accept a visit to Dimona, insisting that a visit was a condition for good diplomatic relations. In responding, Ben-Gurion dragged his feet, citing a cabinet crisis that had to be resolved. By April 1961, the Israeli ambassador told the administration that Israel agreed to a tour of Dimona by U.S. officials. On May 20th, 1961, 2 Atomic Energy Commission scientists visited the site. This visit laid the foundations for a meeting set up by Abe Feinberg, the financial backer of Kennedy's campaign, between Ben-Gurion and Kennedy at the Waldorf Astoria in New York on May 31st, 1961. And that satisfied Kennedy. There was that inspection, and then there was one other one. Then, in 1963, Kennedy brought up the issue of inspections again. In early 1963, however, concerns over Dimona resurfaced. By late January, Kennedy received a new national intelligence estimate that highlighted the weapons potential of the Dimona reactor. They concluded the facility would become operational later in 1963, and that by 1964, the reactor could produce enough plutonium for 1 or 2 bombs every year. In early March 1963, Kent Sherman, director of the Office of National Estimates that produces those reports, signed an intelligence estimate detailing the consequences if Israel nuclearizes. It said, quote, Israel's policy towards its neighbors would become more rather than less tough. It would seek to exploit the psychological advantages of its nuclear capability to intimidate the Arabs and prevent them from making trouble on the frontiers. Furthermore, in dealing with the United States, Israel would use all means in its command to persuade the United States to acquiesce in or even to support Israel's possession of nuclear bombs. In other words, Israel will do whatever it takes to make the United States support its ambitions to get the bomb. This is in March 1963, 8 months before the assassination. On April 2nd, the U.S. ambassador met Prime Minister Ben-Gurion and presented the American request for his assent to semi-annual visits to Dimona in May and November, with full access to all parts and instruments in the facility qualified U.S. scientists. Ben-Gurion responded by saying the issue would have to be postponed until after Passover, which ended on April 15th that year. On April 26th, 3 weeks after the original demand for inspections, Ben-Gurion responded to Kennedy with a 7-page letter that focused on broad issues of Israeli security and regional stability. Claiming that Israel faced an unprecedented threat, Ben-Gurion invoked the specter of another Holocaust and insisted that Israel's security should be protected by joint external security guarantees to be extended by the United States and the Soviet Union. In another letter, to Kennedy's May 4th letter, Ben-Gurion continued his earlier effort to change the conversation while also indirectly explaining the true purpose of Dimona. He wrote of his impressions of the Egyptian president Nasser. He said, Nasser is in fact adopting the National Socialist ideology of the Nazis. For many years, the civilized world did not take seriously Hitler's statement that his aim was worldwide extermination of the Jews. I have no doubt that a similar thing might happen to Jews in Israel if Nasser succeeded in defeating our army. So in other words, in 1963, the CIA tells Kennedy they have this bomb, and if they get it, they are going to wage war on all of their neighbors. They're going to get more aggressive. They're going to force us to accept their nuclear arsenal. It's going to be very problematic for our interests. So Kennedy says we have to inspect this reactor and make sure it's not producing bombs or plutonium for the use in bombs. Ben-Gurion says, well, look, he basically says, look, if we don't get the bomb, it's going to be another Holocaust. He says, Nasser is uniting all the Arabs against us. They're going to destroy Israel. They're going to kill all the Jews in Israel. And the implication is, let us have the bomb. Kennedy says, I want inspections. They say, we need a bomb. That's in a nutshell what they're saying. If that sounds familiar, by the way. The confrontation with Israel escalated when the State Department transmitted Kennedy's latest letter on June 15th for immediate delivery to Ben-Gurion. In the letter, Kennedy fleshed out his insistence on biannual visits with a set of detailed technical conditions. The letter was an ultimatum. If the U.S. government could not obtain reliable information on the state of their reactor, Washington's commitment to and support for Israel could be seriously jeopardized. The letter was never presented to Ben-Gurion. The telegram with Kennedy's letter arrived in Tel Aviv on Saturday, June 15th. The next day, Ben-Gurion announced his resignation, a decision that stunned his country and the world. He never explained in writing or verbally what led him to resign beyond citing personal reasons. So consider the significance of this. Ben-Gurion is the founding father of Israel. He is Israel's George Washington. He is the first prime minister in 1948 when Israel declares its independence. He remains prime minister virtually uninterrupted except for a 2-year period in the 50s. He is Israel's first prime minister. He's effectively their prime minister from 1948 all the way until the day after he gets an ultimatum from JFK about the nuclear program. JFK gets in and is pushing hard. We want inspections. We will not let you get a nuclear bomb. Non-proliferation of nuclear weapons is a priority of the Kennedy administration. He is applying political pressure on Israel to let America inspect its facilities. And the Israelis perceive the pressure is so great. There is actually an Israeli general who said he believed that JFK would send airborne U.S. military troops to inspect the reactor, that they might airdrop soldiers into the desert to look at the plant. That's how afraid of Kennedy they were. And so Kennedy says we have to have inspections. They stall, they delay, they try to change the subject. Finally, Kennedy says, you know what? If you don't let us inspect your nuclear facility at Dimona so we can make sure you're not pursuing a weapon, then we're not supporting you anymore. Now, if the prime minister receives the letter, he has to take it seriously. He has to respond. If he never gets the letter, they can stall more. So Ben-Gurion, the founding father, prime minister for 15 years, resigns coincidentally the day after the letter is received, so he's not able to read it and respond to it. And this is a complete surprise to everybody. He never says why he resigns. Why would a person do this? Nobody sees it coming. It's very mysterious. This is June 1963. This is 5 months before the Kennedy assassination. And it's all surrounding the nuclear program. But this goes on with the succeeding prime minister on July 5th. Less than 10 days after Levi Eshkol succeeds Ben-Gurion as prime minister, the U.S. ambassador delivers a letter from Kennedy. It's identical to the June 15th letter to Ben-Gurion. 2 weeks later, on July 17th, Eshkol requests more time to study the subject. On August 19th, a month after that, Eshkol replies to Kennedy and says he'll allow regular visits of U.S. inspectors to Dimona. He suggested that late 1963 would be the best time for a first visit. Eshkol disregarded Kennedy's demand for twice yearly tours, inspections, while avoiding a frontal challenge to Kennedy's request. In the wake of the letter, the first of the long-sought regular inspections took place in January 1964, 2 months after Kennedy was killed. And when the American inspectors get to Dimona, finally, so again, Kennedy is pushing for inspections the whole time. We want to see the reactor. We want to see the reactor. The CIA report said the reactor would go critical in 63. That's why Kennedy was pushing it. The CIA says the reactor is going critical in 63. That's when it's operational. And by 64, they'll have enough material for bombs. So in 63, Kennedy says, we have to see it. We have to see it. We need to see it by May, by June. In June, Kennedy says, we need to see it or else we're done with you. Ben-Gurion resigns. A month passes. A new guy gets in. Another month passes. He says, all right, we'll do the inspections. 3 months pass, Kennedy dies. December 63, the reactor goes critical. January 64, the Americans arrive for the inspections. It's too late. The reactor's critical. By 1966, Israel has a bomb. Under the administration of Kennedy's successor, Lyndon Johnson. After Kennedy dies, Lyndon Johnson doesn't pursue the issue at all. The inspectors annually, not twice annually, but annually visit Dimona, but there's no rigorous inspections. The inspections are heavily regulated by the Israelis. They give the inspectors the runaround, which is what they had been doing in 1961 and 62. They create this farce. In 62, they created a fake reactor, fake electrical panels, fake everything. They concealed their real activities. And they did something similar under the year of Lyndon Johnson. It was too late anyway, and Lyndon Johnson wasn't even trying to prevent Israel from acquiring a nuclear weapon. Now, again, this brings us to the big question, which is, who killed Kennedy and why? We have to go back to James Angleton. So again, James Angleton, who was the head of the OSS in Italy, if you recall, the forerunner to the CIA. If you recall, Angleton was building his intelligence network during and after World War II by using Jewish emigres that were leaving Europe and going to Israel. So he was working hand in glove with what would become the State of Israel. When he returned to the United States and formed up the CIA. In the 1950s, he was put in charge of counterintelligence in the CIA, and he was working with, as a liaison, all of the other intelligence agencies, the OAS in France, MI6 in the UK, and the Israeli Mossad and Shin Bet. When Angleton returned to the United States, he used the same tricks that he learned in Italy. Angleton was not Jewish. He was from Idaho, but he was a Cold Warrior. Angleton was a fanatical anti-communist. He wanted to bring down the Soviet Union by any means. He was deeply distrusting of everybody else in the CIA. He believed the CIA was penetrated by the KGB. And what Angleton needed when he was running the CIA in the 50s was intelligence on the Soviet Union. But there was a problem. There was no way for American intelligence to penetrate the Soviet Union. They didn't have anybody there. They didn't have any sources. So the United States didn't know what was happening inside Russia. They didn't know what was happening inside the Warsaw Pact, Iron Curtain countries. So Angleton began to use Jews that left the Soviet Union and went to Israel as a source. He cultivated ties with Israel. In his role as a liaison to other intelligence agencies, he headed up the Israel desk at the CIA in 1953, working with Mossad, working with Shin Bet. When the Soviet Union forms up, Russia's filled with Jews. Jews are leaving Russia and going to Israel. They're a valuable source of information about what's happening inside Russia. For example, it was Shin Bet, the Israeli intelligence agency, which was able to acquire Nikita Khrushchev's secret speech in 1956. In 1956, Khrushchev became the general secretary. He succeeded Stalin. He gave a very famous speech where he said that we need to de-Stalinize. They called it the secret speech. Shin Bet acquired the speech. They got it because Jews were coming from Russia out of the Soviet Union to Israel. And they were coming into contact with the Israelis. And many of them were also coming to America too. And so Angleton was using Israeli intelligence and using Jews leaving the Soviet Union and going to Israel as a source on the Soviet Union. That was his angle. Angleton wanted to learn about Russia. The Jews lived there. They were coming to Israel and America. He was using them as a source. That is why he became deeply embedded with Mossad, with Shin Bet. But here's the thing. Israel's number one imperative during this time in the 50s and 60s was acquiring a nuclear bomb. Israel is working with France. Israel's working with the CIA. Israel's working with other countries to acquire the bomb. That is their imperative. That's their number one priority. And so when America needs its intelligence on Russia from the Jews in Israel, Israel's not giving it up for free. What is most likely happening, and what is revealed in the JFK files, is that Angleton was trading secrets. Angleton needed the Jews' secrets about the Soviet Union. The Israelis needed America's secrets about the bomb. So Angleton was trading America's nuclear secrets in exchange for what the Jews knew about the Soviet Union. And Angleton thought that was worth it. Angleton supported Israel because he saw Israel as a Western democratic country, a bulwark against communism. He believed that Egypt, Syria, which were falling under the sphere of influence of the Soviet Union, had to be countered by Israel. He didn't mind that Israel went nuclear. And that is why he not only worked to conceal the extent of Israel's nuclear development from Eisenhower and from Kennedy, but he also actively aided and abetted Israel's nuclear program. So this conspiracy of trafficking weapons to Israel involves organized crime. Trafficking the nuclear secrets to Israel involves the CIA, which is in bed with organized crime. Kennedy was at war with Israel over the nuclear bomb, which is what Angleton was helping them to pursue. Now, again, I said that we would return back to the case of Lee Harvey Oswald and Jack Ruby. Lee Harvey Oswald, like I said earlier, was known to the CIA. He was surveilled by the CIA. The man who shot Kennedy, apparently the lone nut, the lone gunman, he was surveilled by the CIA from 59 to 1963. There was a reason he was being surveilled. He was made aware to the CIA because in 1958, Lee Harvey Oswald goes to the Soviet Union and defects. At this time, James Angleton is running a mail interception program. So James Angleton is running a $1 million per year campaign with hundreds of CIA personnel, and they're reading Americans' mail. They're intercepting mail, and they're reading it for surveillance purposes. The people who they're surveilling is anybody who has sympathies with the Soviet Union, anybody who's going on the other side of the curtain. Lee Harvey Oswald resigns from the Marines, goes to the Soviet Union, says he wants to defect and join up because he's a communist. He sympathizes with communism. It is during this time that Angleton begins reading all of his mail. From 59 to 63, Angleton's crew is reading all of Lee Harvey Oswald's mail. That's why he's being surveilled. And most likely the person that's running this operation is James Angleton, who is again in bed with Mossad and Shin Bet, trading nuclear secrets in exchange for intelligence. Now, it's relevant who's reading the mail. I said before, there's a kicker here. This was revealed during the Biden years, and like I said, I covered this a couple of years ago. So 2 years ago, Joe Biden declassified some documents. I think it was about 4,000 documents. It was in spring 2023. And in these documents, the bombshell in those was the identity of Angleton's guy who was reading the mail. We actually got his name. So over the course of those years, who was intercepting all of Lee Harvey Oswald's mail, who was reading it, and who was handling him? We got his name. The man's name was Reuben Efron, Jewish. This is from the New York Times. It says, quote, on June 22nd, 1962, an intelligence official drafted a memo summarizing a letter intercepted between Lee Harvey Oswald and his mother. This is a year before the assassination. According to an unredacted copy of the memo, the official was named Reuben Efron. Efron was previously listed as being in the room when the Warren Commission interviewed Marina Oswald, Oswald's Russian-born widow, in February 1964. He was the only person present whose title and role were not explained. Efron was monitoring the commission's investigation for James Angleton. So Efron was not only reading Oswald's mail, he was also monitoring the Warren Commission in 64, investigating JFK's death for Angleton. Efron was born in Lithuania in 1911 as Ruvelis Efronis and arrived in the United States via Cuba in 1939, according to immigration papers that described him as a 5'3", 135-pound merchant salesman. In addition to English, he spoke Russian, Lithuanian, Hebrew, Yiddish, and German. He served in the Air Force as an interpreter. His obituary said that after the war, he was a specialist on the Soviet Union and a consultant on foreign affairs, without saying for whom. So Lee Harvey Oswald was not just handled by the CIA. He was being handled by these Jewish emigres from Europe. He was being handled by Angleton's team. Angleton's team was all Jews. These were all Jews leaving Europe, leaving the Soviet Union, all Jews that had left earlier or during World War II or during the days of the Soviet Union. They were all recruited because they knew something about Russia. That's how you know they were under Angleton. And so Lee Harvey Oswald was not just being handled by anybody in the CIA. He was being handled by what basically amounted to something like an Israeli intelligence group inside the CIA run by Angleton. That's the angle. Lee Harvey Oswald was killed by Jack Ruby. I said we'd return to him as well. We talked earlier about how the Jewish mafia was smuggling guns to Israel. They were trafficking arms to Israel to fight the Arabs in the same way that the CIA was helping them get their nuclear bomb. Jack Ruby was not just any ordinary mobster. The man who killed Lee Harvey Oswald, just like Oswald was not handled by anybody in the CIA, he was handled by Angleton working with Israel. Jack Ruby was not just any mobster. He wasn't a lone gunman either, and he wasn't just handled by anybody in the mafia. Jack Ruby was deeply involved with a man named Mickey Cohen, who we talked about earlier, who was one of the primary Jewish gangsters working under Meyer Lansky, smuggling guns to Israel. And I'll read the report about Jack Ruby's connections to Mickey Cohen. It says, quote, Jacob Rubenstein belonged to the Jewish mafia. He had moved from Chicago to Dallas in 1947 on the trail of 15 other Chicago mobsters, 9 of which were Jewish, who had settled there to take over the prostitution business. That is when he changed his name from Rubenstein to Ruby. Ruby's mentor and role model was Mickey Cohen, Jewish LA mobster, who operated in Chicago during Prohibition, but was then active in Hollywood. During his trial for shooting Oswald, Ruby's legal team was fronted by Melvin Belly, a longtime friend and attorney of Mickey Cohen. In 1947, Cohen succeeded Benjamin Siegelbaum, otherwise known as Bugsy Siegel, at the head of Murder Incorporated with Meyer Lansky. Cohen and Siegelbaum were accountable to Meyer Lansky, the most powerful Jewish mafia boss who built his fortune with his Havana casinos and brothels, which were dispossessed by Castro in 1959 in Cuba. Lansky's biographer, Hank Messick, described him as the head of the National Crime Syndicate. Thanks to Lansky, organized crime moved from an ugly growth on the body politic capable of being removed by surgery to a cancerous part of our economic and political system. Gary Ween, a detective sergeant for the LA Police Department, claims in his book he saw Jack Ruby twice in Hollywood in 1946 and 47 in the presence of Mickey Cohen. He writes that Cohen had frequent contacts with Menahem Begin, who was deeply involved with the Jewish militants in Israel, and that he was sharing a girlfriend, the stripper Candy Barr, with Menahem Begin and Ruby. So Jack Ruby was sharing a girlfriend with Mickey Cohen, who worked for Meyer Lansky, and allegedly they both shared the same girlfriend with Menahem Begin, who was running the Jewish terrorism in Israel that Mickey Cohen was sending the weapons to. JFK researcher A.J. Weberman revealed the little-known fact that Ruby traveled to Israel in 1955. And while in San Francisco, Ruby told a friend, "After I leave here, I'm going to Florida to buy a load of contraband to send to Israel." In addition, citing FBI documents, he notes that Lawrence Myers, Ruby's longtime friend, with whom he met at the Cabana Motel the night before JFK's assassination, was a salesman for Aero Manufacturing. The FBI determined that calls were made from that company to a corporation investigated for illegal arms shipments to Israel. In the end, what might be the most telling about Ruby's Mossad connections came out as late as 2003 when William F. Piper, longtime attorney for MLK's alleged assassin James Earl Ray, published in his book, An Act of State, that Ruby was involved in an international arms smuggling operation in 1963 based in Texas, which involved a senior Mossad senior Mossad agent working in South America, acting as a liaison to the U.S. military and the CIA. So when you put all of this information together, there is no smoking gun. You can't say definitively that we know, for example, there's no document that says Israel killed JFK. There's no document that said Israel killed JFK because. But what you can establish is that if the primary entities that mobilized against JFK, that were involved in not only the conspiracy, but had the power to cover it up in media, in the government, if those blocks, those groups are organized crime and the CIA and various intelligence agencies, the thread that ties them together, that connects them, because they're not mutually exclusive, is the Jewish lobby. It is the Jewish penetration of the CIA through James Angleton's personal operation he was running in the CIA for his own purpose, with his own motivation, distrusting his own colleagues, alongside organized crime, which was deeply involved with the Jewish agency, Israeli intelligence, the Israeli state, smuggling arms. And both of those groups working together to secure for their own purposes a nuclear arsenal for Israel. They were animated probably in the service of the goal of securing Israel's nuclear weapon to take out Jack Kennedy. It's circumstantial evidence, but that is the thread that ties all of the conspiracy theories together. That is also the unspoken aspect of the narrative that although people talk about the mafia, the CIA, they'll talk about the Cold Warriors, they'll talk about JFK's wars in the White House, there's one aspect that for, I think obvious reasons, they rarely mention. And now that we have these JFK files, we have 64,000 new documents. We don't have the full 80,000. There's some redactions. We haven't gone through them. What we've already found is basically confirmation that Angleton, who is running the outfit that handled JFK's assassin, that was involved with the organized crime and Israeli elements that were opposed to JFK's Cuba policy, his Israel policy, his Middle East policy in general. Angleton virtually admitted to helping Israel with the bomb. And you combine that with the timeline of JFK's letters to Ben Gurion, I think it paints a very compelling picture that they were involved somehow in his murder. And I want to close with one last thing, because it's sort of funny to me. This is Kennedy's doctrine on the Middle East. So we talked about the nuclear program. There were other reasons the Jews didn't like him. Like we talked about his sympathies with Hitler. This is what he said in a meeting with Golda Meir in 1962. And maybe this will sound familiar, because I think this kind of puts things in perspective, especially in light of recent events. In 1962, Kennedy met with the Israeli Foreign Minister Golda Meir, December 1962. He made it clear to her that the relationship between the United States and Israel is a two-way street. He was concerned about Israel's diversion of the Jordan River waters from Arab states. He was concerned about Israel's retaliatory raids against Arab forces in border areas, like in Jordan, Lebanon, Egypt, Israel's role in the Palestinian refugee problem, and Israel's insistence that the U.S. sell advanced missiles to Israel. U.S. wasn't giving enough aid. This is what he said to Meir, according to notes that were prepared by the Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs. He told Meir that U.S. and Israeli interests are not always the same. He said, "We know that Israel faces enormous security problems, but we do too. Because we have taken on a wide security responsibility, we always have the potential of becoming involved in a major crisis not of our own making. We have to concern ourselves with the whole Middle East. Our security problems are therefore just as great as Israel's. We would like Israeli recognition that this partnership, which we have with Israel, produces strains for the United States in the Middle East. Whether right or wrong, those actions involve not just Israel, but also the United States too." So it's sort of interesting that in the 1960s, it's the same debate that we're having today. And the question is it America first? Is it Israel first? And Kennedy says very plainly to Israel's foreign minister, our interests are not always the same. You have a right to exist, so do we. You have problems, so do we. And Kennedy says what's more, because we're responsible for the world, because we're a superpower, we can get into problems that other people create, like you. You're creating problems for us. And you should keep that in mind and recognize that you're causing problems for us. And it has to be a two-way street for us to continue to support you. That's the Kennedy Doctrine on Israel. That is what became known as the Kennedy Doctrine. And that, applied to Israel's nuclear arsenal, is effectively what got Kennedy killed. Because Kennedy's CIA director, who produced the report, said, look, if Israel gets the bomb, this is bad for the United States. If Israel gets the bomb, it triggers an arms race. It means the Soviet Union is going to be the backer of all the Arab countries. All the Arab countries will turn against us. He said, then maybe they'll pursue nuclear weapons. Oh, gee, you think? That's precisely what happened. In Iraq in the 70s, that is what happened with some other countries that explored this. Syria, Iran, Libya at various times. In some ways, this is a big part of why we've been at war in the Middle East, not just for the past 25 years, but for like 40 years, for 50 years. What's more, the report said if Israel gets the bomb, they'll get more aggressive. That's exactly what happened. Ever since Israel got the bomb, they had a bomb apparently on the eve of the preemptive 1967 war when Israel attacked Egypt and Syria. It is because they had the bomb that they were able to wage war in Lebanon, that they were able to attack other countries and start operations, for example, in Iran, or bomb Iraq's nuclear program and bomb Syria's nuclear program and use the United States and other places. It was true. Kennedy said to Israel, you can't have a bomb. It would be good for you, but it'd be bad for us. You can't have it. And they pleaded with him. They said, look, we need it. There's going to be another Holocaust if Nasser takes over and we don't have a bomb. We're done. Kennedy said, I don't care. You give us inspections because we're against proliferation or you're not our ally anymore. He was killed for this. He was killed for America first. And what happened immediately after is extremely telling. After Kennedy was killed, famously, Lyndon Johnson dropped opposition to the nuclear program. The reactor went critical. They produced a bomb. They then produced an entire arsenal. After Johnson got in and the United States went to Asia, that gave Israel the opportunity to attack Egypt and Syria, and they tripled their land. They invaded the Sinai, the West Bank, Gaza, the Golan Heights. Israel tripled its landmass in the 67 war, in part because the U.S. was busy in Vietnam. They knew it benefited them. Foreign aid to Israel doubled and tripled. And not only did the foreign aid increase, but it went from food assistance and developmental assistance to almost all military aid. So not only did they get double the amount of money, triple the amount of money, but realistically, it all became it was never military aid. It all became military aid. And they got better equipment. Kennedy gave them defensive missiles. Lyndon Johnson gave them tanks, artillery, Phantom fighter jets, and ultimately the nuclear bomb. And that's not to mention, some people say that Lyndon Johnson allowed the American Zionist Committee to restructure their political giving under AIPAC. That's true as well. But I think that's less important than the other aspects. And so that's why people say JFK was the last American president. For 3 administrations, you had this tripartite coalition where Britain, France, and the United States said they would treat the Arabs and the Israelis equally. That was the doctrine that was abided by Truman, Eisenhower, and Kennedy. Truman, Eisenhower, and Kennedy were impartial. And they wanted to protect Israel, but they also defended the rights of the Palestinians. JFK wanted the Palestinians to get compensated or to get their homes back. Palestinians, or rather the Israelis, hated that. So you had 3 administrations that were America first, effectively. Eisenhower resisted Israel's plans and designs on Egypt with Britain and France. Kennedy tried to stop their nuclear program. And once Kennedy died, it was off to the races. From Lyndon Johnson to Nixon, who sent in a massive airlift of weapons in the 73 war. Of course, then to the neocons, to the Jewish Cold Warriors in the Reagan administration, and then Bush, George W. Bush, everything that's happened since, which is now obvious. This is the legacy of the JFK assassination. And you have to really think about it. The mafia, have they ever killed a high-level member of the civilian government? They're going to kill why? They're going to kill Jack Kennedy? That seems pretty audacious. CIA is going to kill a president? The CIA was being run by a Kennedy ally. Now, maybe you say it's Angleton, maybe. Would the CIA really cook that up on their own? Who would be involved in something like that? Who would kill an American president? Who would be audacious? The Israelis are known for using assassinations more than anybody else. Throughout that period, they were assassinating. They assassinated an ambassador from Great Britain. They attacked British infrastructure, American infrastructure, like in the Levant affair. They attacked the USS Liberty. As recently as 1990, they plotted to kill George Bush because of a dispute over the West Bank. Their specialty is assassinations. Who would be bold enough? Who would be audacious? Who would hate America enough to kill our American president, who's so popular and deeply respected? And over what? The question is, would the Israelis kill an American president? Yes. Would they kill to acquire a nuclear arsenal if they thought it was essential to their survival, which they did? Ben-Gurion was obsessed. He said, we need a bomb to prevent another Holocaust. And he said that to Kennedy. He said, if we don't get a bomb, Nasser's going to come in and kill everybody, and it's going to be Holocaust 2 all over again. That's clearly what happened. And that's defined not just American politics, but world politics ever since. And by the way, that's the reason that they don't want to talk about it. That's the reason Ben Shapiro doesn't care who killed Kennedy. And by the way, the subterfuge is so deep, there's a 2-layered conspiracy. There's the JFK killing and the subsequent cover-up, which is, they say, the Warren Commission says it's a lone nut, it's a lone gunman. But then for generations, there's a conspiracy literature that only talks about the CIA. They know it's over. They know their cover's blown. They know that we know that it was a conspiracy. They can't avoid that. They can't defend this lone nut narrative. So they start to promulgate their own conspiracy. There's a layer. There's the official narrative, and then there's a false conspiracy layer. They have promulgated a narrative that it was just the CIA, just the mafia. And if you recall, there was a movie that came out 30 years ago called JFK, starring Kevin Costner, which was a big part of that. Not only all of the many of the mainstream researchers who write books, but there's also a big Hollywood movie directed or written by Oliver Stone. And this big Hollywood movie parodied in Seinfeld and very talked about and popular. It says, well, it's this CIA cutout. It's Clay Shaw. It's this Clay Shaw character. They say it's Clay Shaw running a CIA cutout, which was established in Europe. They handled Oswald. That is the JFK film. And that's a perfect example. The JFK movie was produced by Arnon Milchan, who is an Israeli Jew, arms smuggler, who was critical in Israel getting the nuclear weapon. He paid for the movie. There you go. So, there's something really peculiar about this assassination, this conspiracy in particular. Not only do you have the official narrative, which no one believes, but you even have a conspiracy theory, which is like an official narrative conspiracy theory. A false theory, a false narrative, which is propped up to conceal the real, the second hidden layer, which is that his name was Rubenstein, that Angleton has like honored in Israel. There's a ceremony when he died, and they honored him as an Israeli hero because he helped them get the bomb. There's this layer where you don't talk about how the JFK conspiracy movie was produced by an Israeli who helped Israel get the bomb, where nobody talks about JFK's war with Israel over the bomb, where nobody talks about how Angleton trafficked in Jewish spies in exchange for nuclear secrets, and that he was the one handling Oswald, that he had the 180-page dossier on Oswald on his desk, that organized crime was not just Italian, but also Jewish, and they were all involved in smuggling guns to Israel. And you think they weren't involved in smuggling the nuke to Israel and taking out the guy that was trying to stop it? So this is why the Ben Shapiros of the world don't want to get into it. This is why they're not so interested. Because even just to talk about it, and by the way, here's the last thing I'll say. Here's the big picture. Even if you don't think any of this is conclusive, because there's no smoking gun. It is by no means unambiguous. All of this is circumstantial. All of this is speculative. That's all we can go by because we just don't know. It's not like everyone had a camera phone back then. People say, Governor Connolly, the Secret Service agent, they all say there were multiple shooters. The CIA director says there was multiple shooters. Eyewitnesses say there were multiple shooters. The trajectory of the bullet suggests there's multiple shooters. We don't know who fired the other shots. We don't know definitively if there were other shots. We can't know necessarily. And everyone's dead, okay? Many of the people that had the information died, were suicided. Oswald himself was killed. Ruby died in jail. So even if you don't believe it's definitive, what it does show you is how the world works. Whether you believe that, Israel was behind killing JFK, or if they so control the world, it just looks like they killed JFK. It tells you something about how the world works, doesn't it? Every rock you overturn, whether it's the organized crime underworld, whether it's the CIA, International Intelligence Network, whether it's World War II, the wars in the Middle East, the Cold War, the espionage network, New Orleans, Dallas, New York, Chicago, the elections, the Democratic Party. They're everywhere. They and their vast informal network, and by they I mean the Jews' vast transnational network, which transcends borders, which penetrates intelligence agencies, which hides behind fake corporations, which includes prominent billionaires, organized crime that traffic and blackmail because they run prostitution and drugs. They're in Hollywood. They produce movies. They're headquartered in Israel. They have a nuclear bomb. Whether you think all of them were the water, you could say, in which the conspirators swam in, or whether they did it themselves, it says something about the world. That everywhere you look, in 9/11, JFK, RFK, all these things, you find their control, and yet it's the one thing you're not allowed to talk about. Everywhere across this conspiracy, you will find them. You will find Meyer Lansky, Mickey Cohen, Jack Rubenstein, and his rabbi, and the synagogue he went to the day he shot Oswald. You will find James Angleton and his honorific in Israel, where he is lauded as a hero, his illicit transfer of nuclear secrets to them, and later on how they stole uranium from NUMEC. You will find how he trafficked in Jewish spies to get information for the United States. You'll find all that stuff, but you can never talk about your findings. To say anything other than that they're just individuals who happen to have Jewish last names, that they're not organizing on the basis of ethnicity across lines for a common goal, which is the advancement of themselves as a people and their country. If you say any of that, you're an anti-Semite. So that's the JFK conspiracy. Case closed. Israel did it. I believe Israel did it, and I think that's the reason why. And to me, the most conspicuous aspect of it is the resignation of Ben Gurion. Ben Gurion resigns the day after he gets the ultimatum from Kennedy. He's the founding father of Israel. He says, if we don't get the bomb, there's a Holocaust. Kennedy dies. The reactor goes critical weeks later. Kennedy dies November 22nd. The reactor goes critical in December. In January, the inspections happen. And if you think they wouldn't kill for a nuclear bomb, you're wrong. Because a nuclear bomb's the ultimate power. It's the ultimate checkmate. That has been the guarantor of everything they've done ever since. They got their reactor in 63 to go critical. They got the material in 64. They had a crude bomb in 66. Allegedly, they had it on the eve of the 67 war at the minimum, at the latest. That is what empowered their preemptive war. That is what has empowered their Oded Yinon plan to go to war against all their neighbors, everything that's happened in the 70s, 80s, 90s, noughts, 10s, 20s, what's about to happen. So they would certainly kill for that. It has underwritten all of their ambitions. And by the way, you know, Kennedy was right. That's the last thing I'll say. Kennedy was right. It did start an arms race. When Israel got the bomb, that's why Iraq got the bomb. Iraq went to France. They asked for the bomb. They started building their own nuclear weapons program. Israel bombed it in the 1980s. And it was because Iraq refused to disarm, among other things, invading Kuwait, that the United States invaded in the 1990s because Saddam was still intent on building a bomb. He moved it underground. Non-proliferation was a big reason why we invaded. And then again, of course, in 2003. And the fallout from the Iraq war is why we've been everywhere else. Now Iran is on the threshold of a nuclear bomb, and they're saying we got to go to war with Iran because they want a bomb. Why do you think Iran wants the bomb? Israel has one. They want the deterrent because Israel has the deterrent. So, and it has destroyed our entire country. Could you imagine how different things would have been if Kennedy was able to prevent them from nuclearizing? It'd be a different planet. It'd be a different world. If JFK reformed the CIA, if he destroyed organized crime, if he prevented Israel from nuclearizing, what a different world we would live in.